Okay, lecture number 2, part 4. This is the final part, and so at the end of this series you will have either attended in class, if we can remember back that far, or watched by video all of the lectures that will be covered on the second test. So remember that is chapter 5 from the Boston Tea Party forward, all of chapter 6, all of chapter 7, and at the end of this lecture we will have dealt with all of chapter 8. And so your objective portion of the test comes from you answering the questions that I am posing at the end of each of the video lectures. They'll add up to that 50 points, and then you will have your essay that I will be sending out to you. You'll pick one of the 2 subjects. You will type up a no more than 1-page answer and email that to me, and that will constitute our second test, which remember is an open book test. So the standard for accuracy and good interpretation, as well as spelling and grammar and whatnot, is going to be much higher than it would be for the test that you were taking in class, since you will have all the time that you need to look things up and to use grammar check, spell check, read it over, et cetera, et cetera. So we have elected James Madison to be President of the United States. He is the second former Secretary of State to become president, and he is, of course, continuing the domination of the Democratic-Republican Party in the national government. The Democratic-Republicans control the Congress. They've held on to the White House and to the vice presidency, and the Embargo Act, which had done so much to destroy Jefferson's reputation, has been repealed, and Madison comes in. He doesn't have that problem to deal with, but he still has the problem in Europe and what England and France are doing. They're both imprisoning American sailors. They're both harassing American ships, interfering with American trade, violating what Americans consider to be their neutral rights, and that has to be dealt with. And if you're not going to deal with it the way that Jefferson did, you're going to have to find another approach, and this Madison does by convincing the Congress at the beginning of March of 1809 to pass something called the Non-Intercourse Act. And basically what the Non-Intercourse Act does is it reopens trade with England, France, their colonies, and the territory they control, with this caveat: that if one of those nations will come forward and publicly acknowledge America's definition of its neutral rights, that is, as a neutral nation, our ships get to come and go as they wish, ignore wars and blockades so long as they're not carrying military supplies. If one nation will come forward and do that, the United States will insist that its opponent follow suit, and if it does not, then we will impose an embargo on the second country. So if Jefferson's approach had been all carrots, this is sort of carrots and sticks. And who do you think jumped on it? Napoleon jumped on it. Of course Napoleon jumped on it because as Napoleon saw this, here was his chance to get the United States to do something the French Navy was no longer capable of doing, and that is cut off the flow of commerce between America and England. So Napoleon comes out and says, "Oh, my dear American friends, what was France thinking all these years? We, of course, recognize your rights as a neutral." And that allowed Madison an early political victory. He could turn back to the people in the United States and say, "Hey, do you see what I just did? Oh, Jefferson never did this. Look what I just accomplished." And of course, the sad part of this was that the French were lying. They were not sincere. Napoleon issued secret orders to his privateers to attack American ships trading with Britain. It would take some time for us to realize that, and of course, during that interval, American sympathies had shifted pretty firmly toward the French anyway. After all, England is the traditional enemy, and so it was easy for Americans to swing toward the French, whose navy was much less capable of messing with us, was engaged in impressment to a significantly lesser degree. And so the tension between the U.S. and England begins to grow again as under the terms of the Non-Intercourse Act, the Madison administration turns to the British and says, "Okay, well, the French have agreed to accept our rights as a neutral. What about you? You have to do that now, or you're going to face American economic sanctions." So things are heating up again on the Atlantic, but it turns out that they're also heating up on the American frontier. And the United States has been pushing west since before it was the United States, since the first English colonists landed at Jamestown and at Plymouth. We have been pushing ever west, and one of the reasons that we have been able to do that so successfully is that the Indians who have opposed our westward expansion have always been divided amongst themselves, sometimes within tribes, about whether or not to resist the expansion of the United States, or whether to go along with the expansion, to trade with the Americans, and that sort of business. And so we've always been able to sort of play this game of divide and conquer, to get one group of Indians to fight their traditional enemies, which is another group of Indians, and to take advantage of that fact. But now suddenly, along the frontier of Indiana and Ohio, Indian resistance has significantly increased. It's become a lot stiffer. There are more attacks on settlers and on farms and on settlements, and this is all being orchestrated by a Shawnee warrior chief whose name Tecumseh, and that translates into English as shooting star. And Tecumseh was a leader of great charisma, of significant diplomatic skills and political skills, and not bereft of military skills either. And what he has done is he has gotten all the Indians in the Northwest Territory to ally with one another into an Indian confederacy, basically telling them, unless we unite and put up a common resistance to the expansion of the whites, we are inevitably going to lose our land. And so it's Tecumseh's confederacy now that is the great threat to American expansion. And that is going to have to be dealt with. The settlers on the frontier, of course, are demanding that the government protect them. And the administration of Mr. Madison knows, as does the leadership of the American Army, as do most people, both Indian and American, that inevitably where this is going to take you is a big Indian war. There's going to be another big Indian war, perhaps the biggest one that has yet been seen on the North American continent. And although many men in the military are ready to start that war now, Madison wants more time to prepare, to build up supplies, to train, raise and train troops and that sort of thing. So what he needs in the short run is a détente, an easing of tensions. He needs to get the Indians to back off these frontier assaults, to decrease the pressure on the pioneers, while the U.S. is getting ready for the big war it knows is coming. And the Indians, under Tecumseh for their part, kind of need the same breathing space. They need time to get ready and to prepare. Tecumseh, in particular, wants to be able to coax the Indians of Kentucky and Tennessee into his confederacy. And so both Tecumseh and Madison are desirous of having a temporary truce, if you will. And to achieve that, Madison sends an American army under the command of General William Henry Harrison to northeastern Indiana to meet with Tecumseh. And what Harrison is supposed to do, of course, is to rattle the American saber to show the Indians, hey, look at our army, do you really want to mess with us? But at the same time, he's supposed to meet with Tecumseh and agree to some sort of détente, some sort of easing of tensions. And so the two men agree to meet not far from Tecumseh's home village along Tippecanoe Creek in northeastern Indiana. And here things do not go well because Harrison did not think talking with the Indians was a wise idea. If we take time to prepare, they get time to prepare. It's a wash. If we're going to fight these people, we ought to start fighting them. But generals, remember, do not make policy. Generals carry out policy, and General Harrison has his orders. And so he meets with Tecumseh, and the two men sort of take an instant dislike to each other, and they're sitting on a long bench. And they're talking, and Tecumseh's on one end of that bench, and Harrison's sort of in the middle of the bench. They're keeping that 4-foot distance that psychologists tell us we like to keep between ourselves and people we are not intimate with. It's why when you get in an elevator, you stand in the center, but when somebody else comes in, you go to one corner and they go to another. It's just a human instinct. And so they're sitting there with this separation talking, and gradually Tecumseh scoots closer to Harrison. And Harrison notices, probably unconsciously, and he scoots further away from Tecumseh. He reestablishes that distance between him and the Indian leader, and they talk a little bit more, and then Tecumseh comes scooting closer to Harrison again, and this time consciously Harrison notices it, and he scoots a little further away. Bit more conversation. Here comes Tecumseh one more time, and Harrison notices that if he scooches one more scooch to his right, he's going to be pushed off the bench completely. And apparently the Indian chief thinks that this is funny, and Harrison jumps up and demands to know what Tecumseh thinks he's doing, and Tecumseh responds that he's illustrating a point. He's illustrating how the white man takes the Indians' land, not all at once in big, dramatic, noticeable gulps, but little bit by little bit. You don't even notice it's happening until you look up and all of your land is gone. And as an illustrative point, as a debating point, it's pretty good, but Harrison is not impressed. The arrogance of this Indian leader annoys him, and he believes he knows why Tecumseh has such a confident attitude and why Tecumseh's Confederacy has been able to offer so much resistance. In fact, he believes he knows why this Confederacy exists at all. And it's not because the Indians have put it together and are leading it, which of course is what's really happened, but as far as Harrison's concerned, it's the English in Canada are behind this. They are the real moving force behind Indian resistance, just as back in the day the French had been the moving force behind Indian resistance on the American frontier. And Harrison, who is not impressed by Tecumseh's debating skills, looks at him and he says, "Do you think that the Redcoats can protect you? They're not able to protect themselves. They do not think of going to war for the United States, because if they did, within a few months, you would see our flags flying over all the forts of Canada," unquote. In other words, Harrison's telling Tecumseh, watch it, you're picking a fight that you cannot win, and we know that the Redcoats are behind you, and when push comes to shove, they're going to let you down. So obviously, no détente, the meeting breaks up. Tecumseh immediately leaves to go to Kentucky to try and convince the Indians there to join his Confederacy. And while he's gone, his warriors are left under the leadership of his nephew, an Indian, or his brother rather, an Indian leader known as the Prophet. And against Tecumseh's instructions, the Prophet decides to attack Harrison's camp near Tippecanoe Creek. He sees a vision, and he goes to his warriors and he tells them that he has special medicine that will keep the white man's bullets from harming them. And with that reassurance, they move out to strike the Americans in a surprise attack at dawn on November 7th of 1811. And this instigates the Battle of Tippecanoe. It's a surprise Indian attack. It drives the Americans out of their camp, but Harrison is a good general and his troops are fighters. They rally and they counterattack. The Indians discover that the Prophet's medicine doesn't work, that American bullets can kill and maim and wound them, and the Indians are defeated and driven out of the American camp. Harrison's army then captures the Indian village and destroys it. And so the Battle of Tippecanoe, although it started badly for the Americans, is ultimately a U.S. Army victory, one that came at a price of 38 dead, or rather 61 dead, 127 wounded. The Americans find at least 38 Indian corpses on the battlefield, which hints at Indian casualties being at least as bad or worse than American casualties, since Indians made a habit of carrying off their dead as well as their wounded. But the true significance of the battle was discovered in its aftermath, because as the American troops policed the battlefield, burying the dead, collecting the wounded, picking up arms and munitions and equipment that had been scattered by both the victor and the vanquished, they discovered that the Indians had been carrying British muskets, firing British ammunition, wearing British accoutrements. And in many ways, this is a surprise. The British have been in this part of the world for a long time. Some of this stuff is probably left over from the days of the American Revolution, but it did seem to be literally the smoking gun that proved the accusation that Britain was the driving force behind Tecumseh's Confederacy. And when word of that got back to the American East Coast, the demand for war against the British and the Indian Confederacy became insurmountable. There was a faction in the Democratic-Republican Party known as the War Hawks, and it was led by some very talented, bright, and upcoming political stars who are going to figure large on the American stage for decades to come. Men like Andrew Jackson, a Tennessee politician, judge, and militia leader who declared after Tippecanoe, quote, "The blood of our murdered countrymen must be revenged," unquote. And then you had Henry Clay, an extremely talented politician, a rising political star from Kentucky, who was a member of the House of Representatives and said after Tippecanoe to his fellow congressman, quote, "The conquest of Canada is in your power. I trust I shall not be deemed presumptuous when I state that I believe the militia of Kentucky alone are competent to put Montreal and Upper Canada at your feet," unquote. Of course, Upper Canada being the part around the Great Lakes, Lower Canada being the part near Quebec and Montreal. Then you had John C. Calhoun, a extremely impressive South Carolinian who told the Congress, quote, "In 4 weeks from the time that a declaration of war is heard on our frontier, the whole of Upper and a part of Lower Canada will be in our possession," unquote. In other words, what these men are saying is the war is necessary. It's been forced upon us, according to Jackson. That the war will be easy, according to Clay. We don't need the whole country. Kentucky by itself could win this thing. And Calhoun promising that the war will be short and it will be victorious. There were, of course, people who opposed the War Hawks, who pushed forward a bunch of legislation to expand the Army and call it volunteers and that sort of thing. Men like John Randolph of Virginia, who argued that this really wasn't a war about all the horrible things Britain has been doing to us on the high seas. This is a land grab kind of a war. Randolph argued, quote, "Sirs, if you go to war, it will not be for the protection of or the defense of your maritime rights. Agrarian cupidity, not maritime right, urges this war. For we have heard but one word, like the whippoorwill, but one eternal monotonous tone since the Battle of Tippecanoe, and that word is Canada, Canada, Canada," unquote. But people like Randolph were in the minority. The press was largely in support of demanding war, which was, of course, something that the people of the Democratic Republican states in the South and the West were in favor of as well. Newspapers like the Philadelphia Aurora, who editorialized, quote, "War has been begun with British arms and by Indians instigated by British emissaries. The blood of American citizens has already been shed in actual war begun undeclared," unquote. And the pressure for war against England and their supposed Indian allies now became almost impossible for President Madison to resist. He tried. In accordance with the Non-Intercourse Act, the French had recognized, if dishonestly, our neutral rights. Britain had not. And so after a lot of effort to get Britain to do that, Madison in April of 1812 signed a 90-day embargo against Britain. We were going to cut off trade for 90 days with the clear implication that if the British have not rescinded the orders of council by then and stopped harassment by then, there would be a war. The 90 days came, the 90 days went, and no answer from the British. So on June 12th of 1812, President Madison became the first American chief executive to ask the Congress to declare war on a foreign power. The Congress debated the question until June 18th. And in fact, it wasn't much of a debate. Much of that time was spent with every member of Congress and the Senate stepping forward to make a speech, most of them in favor of the war, but not all of them, because the Federalists were vehemently opposed to the war. Remember that the Federalists are primarily in New England. That is their bastion of strength. They have argued since the days of Washington that a war with England is a horrible idea. It will lead to an invasion of the U.S. from Canada. It will lead to a blockade of American ports. It will lead to our commerce being swept from the world's oceans. There's no way that we can beat the British. We might not like what they're doing, but picking a fight with them seems like a horrible idea, especially if the primary motive, as Federalists seem to suspect, is really a desire to grab Canada while Britain's back is turned fighting Napoleon. But that said, the Federalists are now in the minority. And on June 18th, the vote for war was held, and the declaration was approved by a margin of 79 to 49 in the House and 19 to 13 in the Senate. So the United States has declared war on England, our second war with England, our first actual declared war in our national history. But we go into that conflict as a divided country because every single Federalist in the Congress voted against the declaration of war. None of that was to the political detriment of James Madison. 1812 is an election year. That November he runs for and easily elected to a second term, but that second term is going to be consumed by the new conflict, the War of 1812. And that war begins on an ironic note because Mr. Madison had war declared in June, and 5 days after the declaration of war, Parliament, under pressure from British merchants, had finally repealed the Orders of Council, had given in, but it was now too late. As the Philadelphia Aurora put it, if England were now to restore all impressed seamen and make compensation for all of her deprivations, we should listen to no terms that did not include the cession of Upper Canada, unquote. So Britain's repeal of the Orders of Council was a dollar short and a day late, and that means there's going to be war. And that war was supposed to be, as the leaders of the Democratic Republican Warhawk faction promised, it was supposed to be quick and it was supposed to be easy, and it was none of those things. In fact, it was difficult, it was long, and it was very, very hard. With New England basically opposed to the war, there was no real way to fight the British along the old traditional route from the French and Indian War and the American Revolution, up Lake Champlain, aiming at Quebec and Montreal. There just wasn't enough support amongst the people who lived there for operations in that sector. So most of the land fighting is going to take place around the Great Lakes, and we're going to invade British Canada, and the British are going to invade American territory. The fighting is going to seesaw back and forth. There are going to be some notable American disasters very early on. And the upshot of it is what you finally get out of that is a stalemate. Neither side gains much of an advantage, although the Americans win some significant naval victories on the Great Lakes that are going to keep the British from being able to really push into American territory. But it's stalemate. It's stalemate there. The only things of great importance that come out of that is that the myth that we don't need a regular professional army, that we can rely on the militia, that myth born out of the American Revolution that actually isn't even valid when you look at the American Revolution, had taken hold of the American public. And so we went into the War of 1812 convinced that we could do this with our militia, and we found out, as we had found out in the American Revolution, no, we can't. And so one of the things that occurs is the building of a new professional American army led by people like Brigadier General Winfield Scott and Brigadier General Jacob Brown, who take 6 months in 1813 to really thoroughly train and drill their troops before taking them into battle. And these regulars prove their mettle on the field of action, just like the Continental troops trained by von Steuben had proven their mettle at the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse. And as a consequence, we do stabilize the front along the Great Lakes, even though both Brown and Scott are wounded. In one of the battles that they fight, Tecumseh is killed, and that is a critical outcome because his death was the death of the Indian Confederacy. It really was his leadership, his skill, his charisma that had kept that Indian Union together, and when you remove him from the equation, that Indian Confederacy falls apart, which means the Indians are going to be easier to conquer. It was only at sea that the United States did really well at the beginning of the war. And in fact, for the first year of the war, we did exceptionally well. The American Navy was relatively small, but it was good. Our ships were exceptionally well built and armed for their size. We had been fighting the French in the Quasi-War. We'd been fighting the Tripoli pirates, so it was a veteran force with veteran crews and veteran captains. They knew their business. The English underestimated the American Navy. They didn't think much of it, and so they didn't send enough ships. They didn't send their best ships, their best captains, and their best crews to cope with the Americans, and they suffered for that. So just a handful of months into the war, there was the beginning of a trend of American single-ship victories over their British opponents. That begins when an American frigate by the name of the USS Constitution, which of course is still around, is the oldest commissioned ship in the U.S. Navy. The USS Constitution, under Captain Isaac Hull, takes on a British warship, the HMS Guerrier, in a prearranged duel that the two captains got in touch with each other, said, okay, let's see who's really the best. We'll meet you here, this spot on the ocean on a certain day. And the two ships closed within 50 yards of each other, and they began to duke it out. Most naval battles like this don't last very long. Within 10 or 15 minutes, one side or the other gets the upper hand, knocks down the enemy's mast, tears up its sails so it can't maneuver, which means it's a sitting duck. And in this instance, it was the Constitution that prevailed. The Constitution was so well built out of good, strong American oak that British cannonballs actually bounced off her hull, and she got a nickname that she still bears as a result. She became Old Ironsides, and the Guerrier was forced to surrender. It was an American victory, which humiliated the British Navy. It led the London Times to angrily declare that, quote, never before in the history of the world has an English frigate had to strike its colors to an American, unquote, which is ignoring some American victories in the American Revolution, but it illustrates the point. The British were very embarrassed by this, and they're going to be more embarrassed because the victory of the Constitution over the Guerrier begins a series of American triumphs over British forces. The USS Wasp over the HMS Frolic, the USS United States over the HMS Macedonian, the USS Constitution off the coast of Brazil over the HMS Java. In fact, American ships beat their British counterparts with such regularity for the first year of the war that the British Admiralty had to issue secret orders to their ship captains. Do not engage in equal combat against Americans. If you can't gang up on them 2 or 3 to 1, then run away. But of course, what this ultimately leads to is the British taking us seriously and sending more ships with better crews and better captains, and ultimately the tide was going to turn. And it turned in September of 1813 when our old friend, the USS Chesapeake, got into a fight with the HMS Shannon, which for the numbers of men engaged is still the bloodiest battle by percentage in American history. The Chesapeake, under Captain James Lawrence, was getting the worst end of it. She was being shot to pieces. She had suffered heavy casualties. Her captain was mortally wounded, and he was laying on the deck dying, and his officers clustered around him and asked if they should strike their colors and surrender. And Captain Lawrence's dying words are ones that you have all probably heard before, although perhaps without knowing the context. He said, quote, "Don't give up the ship. Fight her until she sinks," unquote. And that's what his crew did. The British had to board the Chesapeake and take her in hand-to-hand combat, but take her they did. And after that, things are going to go badly for the American Navy. And although 500 American privateers would put to sea during the war, and they would seize more than 1,300 prizes from the British, that could not compensate for the fate of the U.S. naval fleet, which was either destroyed and captured or bottled up in its ports, unable to take the offensive against the British anymore. And by 1814, American maritime trade was down to 11% of its pre-war levels. And so the prediction that if we picked a fight with England, they would sweep our commerce from the high seas and they would blockade our ports had come to pass. And so after a brief period of glory on the high seas, we're on the losing end of this thing. And although we've managed to fight things to a stalemate along the Great Lakes, that had not been what had been anticipated or what had been promised. And things are going to seemingly go from bad to worse when, in April of 1814, Napoleon Bonaparte is driven from power. The British, Russian, Prussian, and Austrian armies are converging on Paris. Napoleon has no choice but to accept terms. He's exiled to the island of Elba in the Caribbean. The French monarchy is restored, and suddenly the war in Europe, which has been raging since February of 1793, is over. and that means Britain is left fighting only one country on the face of the planet, and that country is the United States. And boy, are the British angry at us, because as far as they're concerned, while they had their back turned grappling with the Antichrist Napoleon, the United States had risen up and stabbed England in the back. And they are determined now to get even with us. Now, remember that Napoleon is going to return in 1815 for a glorious 100 final days that will end in his ultimate defeat at Waterloo, but that is some distance in the future. So right now, the British can concentrate on us. The British people, the British press are really eager to even the score with the United States, and England sends 15,000 additional troops to America. 10,000 of them go to Canada, and the rest to British islands in the Caribbean, poised for a strike somewhere along the American coast. And the U.S. now is in pretty bad shape. If we have only been able to fight England to a standstill while most of their forces were fighting Napoleon, now they can concentrate on us. For the British, of course, sending more troops to America is only part of the puzzle. The question is, what do they want in a campaign against America, and how are they going to win that campaign? Now remember, England had tried for 8 years during the Revolutionary War to conquer America, had been unable to do it. Granted, the French had come into the war, and that had made a big difference, but the realities of America are the same. It's a vast country. It's far bigger now than it was at the time of the American Revolution. There are a lot more Americans now than there were time at the American Revolution. And although Britain is no longer fighting anybody, she's worn out from a 21-year-long war. So how exactly are the British going to conquer the Americans? That was not an easy question to answer. And in fact, the Duke of Wellington, who played a key role in the defeat of Napoleon, and to be the guy who really finishes him off at Waterloo in June of 1815, is offered command of British forces in America, and he declines it. He declines it. Want nothing to do with it. He says, I do not know where you could carry on an operation which would be so injurious to the Americans as to force them to sue for peace, unquote. But the British are going to try. They want to force the Americans to make concessions. And the concession the British really want is the return of the Louisiana Purchase to Spain. As far as Britain is concerned, the French had stolen the Louisiana Purchase Louisiana territory from the Spanish once they conquered Spain, and the British have no love for the idea of the United States becoming a continental power and thus a great rival in the future. So what the British want to force the Americans to do is to surrender the Louisiana territory back to Spain. That's the way the British are going to convince us that they have won the war and we have lost it. So in 1814, the British are going to launch their great effort to defeat the Americans and end the War of 1812. And they come up with a three-pronged strategy, and part of that is going to sound very familiar to you because one part is a British invasion from Canada down the Lake Champlain route, pointing toward Albany, New York. Another is a British offensive into the Chesapeake Bay area that will aim initially at the American capital of Washington, D.C. And so this sounds a lot like the British campaign of 1777, doesn't it? With Burgoyne pushing down from Montreal to his ultimate defeat at Saratoga, and the British under Howe attempting to capture the American capital by seizing Philadelphia. How well does this go? Well, it gets off to a good start. In August of 1814, the British land an army on the Potomac River. It marches overland to attack Washington, the new American capital city. The Americans had not expected the British to attack Washington because it was a small place. It was kind of insignificant. It was much more likely that the British would attack a significant target like, say, Baltimore, the third biggest city in America. And so we had not fortified Washington, and as a consequence, when the British lunged toward it, it was not in a state of defense. We hurriedly cobbled together a makeshift force of some Marines, some regulars, a militia that tried to defend the city, and basically put up a decent fight at the Battle of Bladensburg, but the British routed them. They marched into the city. President Madison and his cabinet were forced to flee at the last moment. They in fact fled so quickly that their hot Dinner was still sitting on the tables of the White House. Mrs. Madison, Dolly Madison, the First Lady, was almost captured. She refused to leave the executive mansion until a large portrait of George Washington was rescued, which very brave of her. She managed to get away before the British got there, but the capture of the city, the British did. And when a single American fired a single sniper shot at them, the British took this as a pretext to burn most of the public buildings. The Executive Mansion, the Capitol building, several others. They said this was retaliation for the American burning of the city of York in Canada early in the war. And having burned the city, the British then marched away. Some days later, the government's going to come back. It's going to set up shop again. The public buildings, of course, were made out of stone, so the facades were still there. It was the interiors that had to be rebuilt. And as the interior of the Executive Mansion was reconstructed, Mrs. Madison asked the workers to put a coat of whitewash on the building to cover up the scorch marks from where the British had put it to the torch. And it was from that point forward that Americans began to refer to the home of the president not as the Executive Mansion, but as the White House. There's a lot of American folklore that comes out of the War of 1812. For the British, though, this was kind of the high point of their attempt to subdue America. As the British Army marched back to its ships after burning Washington, it had the bad luck to get caught in a storm. A tornado actually swept through the ranks of the British Army, which rattled the troops very badly. They got on their ships. They sailed for a more important and juicier target than Washington, D.C. That target was, in fact, the city of Baltimore, which was well defended. The British landed an army there, which began an overland march toward Baltimore. The Americans were there to resist it. They fought and lost a battle and were driven back into their earthworks around the city. But in the fighting, an American sniper put a bullet through the brain of the commander of the British Army. And at that point, the battered British Army, still shaken by its experience with the tornado, said, you know what, we're going to let the Navy win this thing. And if the British Navy was going to conquer Baltimore, it was going to have to get past the guns of Fort McHenry, which guarded the entrance into Baltimore Harbor. The British didn't want to sail their ships right up against the fort, so they relied on their mortar boats, which could hurl shells in a high trajectory and drop them down into the fort. And so the British began a bombardment of Fort McHenry. And in this bombardment, they pummeled the fort pretty heavily all day and all night long on the edge there of Baltimore Harbor. The fighting went on all through September 12th of 1814. The British hurling rockets and shells into Fort McHenry, which fired back for a while during the day, but once it became night, Fort McHenry ceased firing. The British, of course, kept pummeling it, and it was quite the fireworks show. These rockets arching through the air, leaving a fiery trail, and the fuses of the mortar bombs, hurtling through the air to drop in and around and explode all over the fort. And by dawn on September 13th, dawn of September 14th, the British had expended most of their ammunition. Fort McHenry had not fired back all night long, and there was a question about whether or not it had been abandoned. If the British had shelled the garrison out of the fort, then they were free to sail into Baltimore Harbor and capture the city. There was a dense fog that morning. There was no breeze. The battle smoke hung thickly over the bay, and everyone was looking keenly at Fort McHenry to see any sign of whether or not it was still occupied. Just as the sun came up, a scene that only a movie could have, I suppose, crafted. The clouds begin to part, the breeze picks up, the sunlight comes down onto Fort McHenry, and a huge American flag unfurls from its flagstaff, and the Americans begin firing again. It was very clear that Fort McHenry had not been subdued, and the British were forced to sail away. As they sailed away, they released an American lawyer who had spent the battle in an awkward spot. He had rowed out to the British fleet to a truce ship. to get the release of a friend who had been mistakenly arrested by the British as an American spy. And this young lawyer got his friend off, but the battle had started before they could return to shore, and the British therefore kept them there during the fight. And so they had watched it from the British vantage point, had watched the shelling, had watched the rockets, had waited with bated breath on the morning of September 14th to see if Fort McHenry was still occupied or had been abandoned. And after they were released, this young lawyer went home, sat down, and wrote a long poem to commemorate what he had witnessed. And he had that poem published under the title of the Star-Spangled Banner. And sometime later it was put to music, and ultimately in the 1880s it becomes our national anthem. And so the next time you stand up and you sing about the rocket's red glare and the bombs bursting in air, giving proof to the night that our flag was still there, you're singing about one of the few outright American military victories in the War of 1812. At just about the same time as the American victory at the Battle of Fort McHenry, there's another American victory at Plattsburgh Bay in New York, at the southern end of Lake Champlain. The Americans had a naval base there, which was defended by a small army. The British had come down from Montreal with an army and a fleet. The army, of course, didn't make an attack on Plattsburgh Bay because what really mattered was the American naval squadron there, which the British attempted to destroy. And in a very hard-fought engagement, the American naval squadron triumphed and beat back the British at Plattsburgh Bay and forced the British to turn around and go back to Canada. So two of the three prongs of the British invasion of the United States in 1814 are broken off, and that gives impetus to negotiations between British and American representatives that have really been going on since the war began in June of 1812 and are taking place in the city of Ghent, Belgium. Of course, until those negotiations bear fruit, the war is still going on. And for the Federalists, this war has been a calamity. Everything that they had predicted had come to pass. The blockade of American ports, the destruction of American commerce, the invasion of the United States from Canada and from the Atlantic. And for the Federalists, this was all extremely frustrating because they had not been able to stop the war. And the Federalists knew that their power was waning. They had at one time been the majority party, and now they're distinctly the minority party. And as new states enter the Union from the West, those new states are dominated by Democratic Republicans. In other words, the handwriting is on the wall. Democratic Republicans are simply going to get stronger and stronger and stronger, and the Federalist Party is going to get weaker and weaker and weaker, and as it gets weaker, its ability to influence policy, to influence legislation is going to disappear. Proof in point, they hadn't been able to stop the War of 1812. But now, having been proven right in so many ways, they believed that they had some leverage and they intended to use it. So in December of 1814, the Federalists convened a convention in Hartford, Connecticut. This comes to be known as the Hartford Convention. And at the Hartford Convention, the Federalists looked for a way to reverse not only the disastrous policies they believe the Madison administration has been pursuing, but to put themselves in a stronger political position. And what comes out of the Hartford Convention is a list of demands by the Federalist Party. And these demands are in the form of amendments to the U.S. Constitution. And so from the Hartford Convention come Federalist demands for a constitutional amendment that would require a 2/3 majority vote of the Congress to declare war. Not the simple majority the Constitution states, but a 2/3 majority vote. Then they want a constitutional amendment to require a 2/3 majority vote to pass commercial regulations like the Embargo Act, for example. Then they want a constitutional amendment to admit a to require a 2/3 majority vote to admit a new state into the Union. They want a constitutional amendment reducing the presidency to a single term. And they want a constitutional amendment ending the 3/5 compromise, not in a way that you would count all slaves as a citizen for the purposes of representation in Congress, but that you will count no slaves for the purposes of representation representation in Congress. And why do these things? Well, if you get rid of the Three-Coast Compromise and you don't count slaves at all, then you're going to reduce the number of Southern congressmen, which of course reduces this number of Southern electoral votes. Why have a one-term presidency? Because you're probably not going to elect any Federalists to the presidency anymore. That's how much sway the Democratic Republicans have demographically. So why not limit the damage that these Democratic Republican presidents can do? Why a 2/3 majority vote to admit a new state in the Union? Because right now the Federalists are a little more than a third of the body politic, but if you keep admitting new states, they're going to slip below that third. So what you're doing is you're going to freeze the number of states. And by freezing the number of states, you're going to freeze the political status quo. And if you freeze the political status quo and you require a 2/3 majority vote to declare war, or to admit a new state, or to pass commercial regulations, you're giving the Federalist a veto because they're less than half, but they're more than a third. And so this is the kind of political advantage that the Federalists are hoping to get out of what looks like a lost war, a failing national cause. Unfortunately for the Federalists, they decide to wait, to press their demands. Congress is out of session. It's not going to come back into session until after Christmas, so they have to wait, and that wait turns out not to be to their advantage, because while that pause is taking place, the last great battle of the War of 1812 is taking place at New Orleans, the Battle of New Orleans. The commander of the American forces there was Andrew Jackson, who had made a name for himself earlier by defeating the Creek Indians, one of the more obstinate Indian tribes in the Southeast, one of the more dangerous Indian tribes of the Southeast. And now a general in the American Army, Jackson was in charge of defending the southern coast. He knew the British were going to invade somewhere, but there were a lot of places they can invade, up to Mobile or Pensacola in Spanish Florida. New Orleans seemed the least likely spot, and so Jackson kept most of his troops around Mobile and Pensacola. And when a British army under the command of General Pakenham, supported by a British fleet, launched at New Orleans, Jackson was sort of caught off guard. He was forced to cobble together an army very quickly, an army that consisted of Indians, pirates from the fleets of John Lafitte that lurked in the bayous of southern Louisiana, who brought with them cannon and the know-how to use them, and of course had their own reasons for hating the British. Louisiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Kentucky militiamen, even a couple of brigades of free blacks drawn from the city of New Orleans. And this makeshift force he fortified behind a dry canal on a plantation known as Chalmette, south of New Orleans. He had an impassable swamp on his left flank, and he had the Mississippi River on his right flank, and he used cotton bales as fortifications, and he waited for the British to come at him. Now, the Battle of New Orleans is actually a complex series of military engagements that span almost a week in time. It's much more sophisticated militarily than is usually understood, but the main act of the Battle of New Orleans is simple enough. And that occurs on January 8th of 1815, when General Pakenham launches a frontal assault against Jackson's lines on Chalmette Plantation. This is what most people understand to be the Battle of New Orleans. It's a very badly managed affair by the British, who have to cross 650 yards of open ground to attack fortified Americans, and it sort of becomes a Bunker Hill thing all over. Although the British do manage to briefly penetrate one part of the American line close to the Mississippi River, basically they're mowed down in the open field by American artillery and American rifle fire. It's a fairly easy victory for Jackson's forces. Of 2,000 attacking redcoats, 1,971 become casualties, including Pakenham, who's killed, 3 of his generals, 8 of his colonels shot down, and the American losses are 13 dead and 58 wounded. So it's a very lopsided victory. It makes Jackson famous. That ultimately will make him president one day, but it has consequences far beyond that, because if the British had defeated Jackson and taken New Orleans, they would have had a stranglehold on the use of the Mississippi River. And with that economic stranglehold, they could have forced America into concessions. And of course, the concession that the British wanted was the surrender of the Louisiana Purchase, the giving of Louisiana back to Spain. But because Jackson had won that victory, the Americans hold on to the Mississippi, and Jackson's victory combined with that at Fort McHenry and Plattsburgh Bay really do make the British face the reality that there's no way they're going to conquer the United States. There's no way that they're going to very quickly force the Americas to make concessions, and a worn-out Britain is just not up to additional years of warfare in an effort to win the day on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. And so the peace negotiators get serious, and even before the Battle of New Orleans is fought on December 24th of 1815, in the city of Ghent, Belgium, American and British representatives signed the Treaty of Ghent that ends the War of 1812 on the basis of the status quo ante bellum. That is Latin for the way things were before the war. So the fighting is simply going to stop. No compensation, no apologies, no exchange or loss of territory. We're just going to stop fighting. Interesting thing about the Treaty of Ghent is it would not go into effect, and there would be no ceasefire until it was ratified by both the British Parliament and the United States Senate. And the reason, of course, the British had done that is they knew that Pakenham was about to attack New Orleans, and if his attack had succeeded, the British Parliament could have refused to ratify the Treaty of Ghent, forced the Americans back to the conference table where we had to have surrendered the Louisiana Purchase. And so Jackson's victory at the Battle of New Orleans was key to saving the Louisiana Purchase for the United States. And although some people like to argue that that battle was fought after the war was over, that's not true. The Treaty of Ghent made it very clear, no ceasefire until the treaty is ratified. And of course, Jackson's victory, along with those at McHenry and Plattsburgh Bay, are going to make ratification both in London and Washington, D.C. A simple thing to accomplish. So, interesting thing about the way the war ends is that the actual sequence of events is the Hartford Convention, undertaken by the Federalists at a point where it looked like the war was going to be endless and the war was being lost by the United States. Then the Treaty of Ghent a few weeks later, and then the Battle of New Orleans. And in that correct chronological sequence, Hartford Convention, Treaty of Ghent, Battle of New Orleans, there's a certain logic. But the way the country learns about these things is almost in the exact opposite order. And that has enormous political consequences. So we already knew that we'd won at McHenry and Plattsburgh. Now comes word of the victory at New Orleans, because that was a victory that took place here on American soil, and so news of it gets back east very quickly. We've won this great, big, dramatic victory, and Jackson's a new hero, and there's an enormous amount of celebration. And just as that celebration reaches its peak, here comes the ship from England, or rather from Europe, bearing news of the Treaty of Ghent, and suddenly, oh, the war's over. Nobody notices that the treaty's got to be ratified. No, the war's over. The British have thrown in the towel. They have kind of given up. And in the wake of the celebration that follows word of the Treaty of Ghent, who rides into town with their demands for constitutional amendments and their implied threat of secession if they don't get what they want. The Federalist Party, the Federalists were willing to break up the Union when we were engaged in a war with England, our arch enemy, our back against the wall. The Federalists were willing to break up the Union to gain political advantage. And whereas when they drafted those demands, the war seemed to be lost and they had leverage, by the time they present those demands, the war doesn't seem to be lost. In fact, it very much looks like the United States had won the war. And so the Federalist Party is looked upon as traitorous. You were willing to pull the rug out from under the country. You're willing to make a separate peace. You're willing to break up the Union when we're fighting England. And with its leverage gone, the Federalists now have the stamp of treason pounded into their forehead, and they don't recover from that. This leads to the breakup of the Federalist Party. And so the fact that the news came in the opposite order actually was about as bad a set of circumstances for the Federalists as you could possibly imagine. So the War of 1812 does not lead to the U.S. conquest of Canada. It does lead to the end of impressment But then, of course, the end of the war in Europe would have meant the end of impressment. So what does that really gain the United States? You didn't really need a war for that to happen. The war does bring about the death of Tecumseh and the collapse of the Indian Confederacy, which is very much to the benefit of the United States. But Tecumseh's Confederacy would have probably been beaten at some point regardless. Did you need a war with Britain to accomplish that? And the answer is probably no. And so at the end of the day, was the War of 1812 worth it? Did the United States win the war? And from a strict technical sense, if you look at what you wanted when you went into the war and what you got when the war was over, we didn't particularly win it. The things that we got out of it, we would have gotten out of the end of the war in Europe. We didn't need to fight the British to gain those advantages. The Louisiana Purchase would have never been under threat if there hadn't been a War of 1812. So the fact that it was saved was to America's benefit, but we created ourselves the circumstances under which we had to save it. The War of 1812 is going to make Jackson president, so that's an important and interesting byproduct. But of course, that was not what you started the War of 1812 to accomplish. So militarily, the war was sort of fought to a draw. But psychologically, it wasn't. Psychologically, the Americans believed that they had won. It's sort of akin to a football game where at the end of 3 quarters, the score is 50-0. And one side looks like it's easily going to win, and that would be England. And then in the 4th quarter, the side with 0, in this case the United States, comes roaring back, and they manage to score 50 points, and just as the clock ticks down to 0, they kick the field goal that ties the game 50-50. And does anybody win a tie game? And of course the answer is no. But does one side feel like it lost and the other side feel like it won? And of course the side that blew the 50-point lead is going to feel like it lost. And the side that came roaring back to tie the game at the last second is going to feel like it triumphed. And that's basically the United States in the War of 1812. But more than that, perhaps, the United States had also created for itself a sense of national identity out of the War of 1812. There's a reason. There's all this folklore. Don't give up the ship. The Battle of New Orleans, the White House, the Star-Spangled Banner, that all of that comes out of the War of 1812 because it created for an American that had really not had this notion of being one country before. That in fact we were a nation. New England, Middle, Northwest, South, we were all one country, all fighting together against a common foe. And so we get out of the War of 1812 a sense of common national identity. And one British officer summed it up pretty well when he talked to an American counterpart after the war was over. You've done pretty well for yourself. We had been bullying you. We'd been pushing you around. You stood up and you fought. You wouldn't let yourself be bullied anymore. And in fact, Britain is never going to be able to treat the United States the same way again. So the respect of the world and the respect of the British has been won by our effort in the War of 1812. And so that is a highly consequential thing. So the War of 1812 comes to an end. The Madison administration, of course, is going to come to an end at the conclusion of his second term in 1816. And when Madison's second term ends, there's only going to be one political party. The Federalists have self-destructed, courtesy of the Hartford Convention. The Democratic Republicans are the only ones around. They get tired of the long and cumbersome name, so they stop saying Democratic Republicans and they just start calling themselves Republicans. Ironically, that's not the birth of the modern Republican Party. This is the beginning of the creation of the modern Democratic Party, as we'll come to understand as we move forward. So that takes us through the end of Chapter 8. This is thus the conclusion of all the material that will be covered on the second test. I will be sending that out to you, at least the essay portion of it, very shortly after these videos go up. And so the only thing that remains now are 5 questions that you will need to answer and send in to me. So first question, true or false, James Madison was a Secretary of State before he was elected to the presidency? True or false, James Madison was the Secretary of State before he was elected to the presidency? Second question, true or false, the Chesapeake Affair led to the outbreak of the War of 1812. True or false, the Chesapeake Affair leads to the outbreak of the War of 1812. In other words, because of the Chesapeake Affair, the United States immediately goes to war with England. Next question, name of the Indian leader who attacked General Harrison's army and started the Battle of Tippecanoe. Name of the Indian leader who led the attack on Harrison's army and started the Battle of Tippecanoe. Next question, name of the American fort whose defense inspired the writing of the Star-Spangled Banner. Name of the American fort whose defense inspired the starting of the writing of the Star-Spangled Banner. And then last question, true or false, the Battle of New Orleans was actually fought after the War of 1812 was officially over. True or false, the Battle of New Orleans was actually fought after the War of 1812 was actually over. So send those answers to me by email. Look for the email with the essay questions, and remember, if you have concerns or questions or anything like that, email me, reach out. Let's try and stay in touch with each other, and we will go forward with the second test, and the next series of video lectures will begin the material to be covered on our third and final test at the end of the semester. Hope you all are doing well, and we will see you soon.